Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. The title of today's webinar is Safe Food for Canadian Regulations, Preventive Control Plan Guide, How to Meet Safe Food for Canadian Regulations, the Requirements. Recently, the Quality and Food Safety team at Perennia developed a guide for the fresh fruit and vegetable sector, primary producers, processors, and storage facilities to assist them with meeting the Safe Food for Canadian regulations. Today, we will go through that guide. We will also focus heavily on preventive controls and the preventive control plan. I just want to quickly introduce the presenters today. My name is Shelley McDonald, and I am here with Elaine Grant. And we are members of the Quality and Food Safety team at Perennia. We work with clients, assisting and coaching them with the development and implementation of food safety and quality management plans. I just want to let you folks know that as soon as we go through the outline, Elaine and myself, we will turn our cameras off as we go through the presentation. I do ask if you have any questions, please submit those in the chat bar. Elaine will be compiling those questions, and at the end, we will have a question and answer period. You will also be provided with quick links and resources and the CFIA gap assessment template at the end of the presentation as well. So the outline for today is going through the Safe Food for Canadian regulations, an overview, the purpose and how to use the guide, determining the requirements, looking at the glossary, the preventive control requirements, the preventive control plan requirements, traceability requirements, commodity specific requirements, and also reviewing the appendix. I'm just going to stop sharing the screen and pull up the guide. So you folks, for those of you who've had a chance to look at it, that's great. And for those of you who have not had a chance, I'll give you a few seconds to look at it. So this is a guide when you go to the Perennia.ca website. If you click on quality and food safety and scroll down to food safety resources, this will be the first resource that you come to. So it is the Safe Food for Canadian Good Agricultural Practices designed for the fresh fruit and vegetable sector. The table of contents you will see, we'll just quickly go over them before starting the presentation. So the first thing is an overview, and it's the overview of Safe Food for Canadian regulations. Then it talks about the type of food safety hazards controlled by preventive control plans. It then goes on to the purpose of the guide. So how do you use this guide and the guide layout? Next is determining what is applicable to your operation, as each of you are in a different situation depending on what you do at your operation. Then there's a glossary. Then it gets into the preventive controls. So that's what a lot of you are probably here to talk about today, is the preventive controls with Safe Food for Canadian regulations. And then it goes into the investigation, notification, complaints, and recalls, preventive control plan, traceability, commodity specific requirements, and the appendix. Under the appendix, you will find how to draft an SOP, policy procedure, what is expected during your CFIA audit or inspection, how to respond to a non-compliance, labeling for traceability, environmental swabbing, and cross-contamination points when addressing those using your hazard analysis. You will also find on our website downloadable forms that complement this guide. Just keep in mind that you do have to tailor these downloadable forms to your operation. So I'm going to stop sharing my camera, and I'm going to bring the presentation back up, and we will get started. So Safe Food for Canadian Regulations Overview. Most of you are familiar with the changes. The Safe Food for Canadian Regulations came into effect on January 15th of 2019. Now keep in mind these timelines may vary based on the commodity specific industries. So not everybody had to have everything in place on January the 15th, 2019. But it is your responsibility to know when you had to start and put those things in place. So why the changes anyways? Well, FSMA, which is the Food Safety Modernization Act in the USA, was the big driver as Canada wanted to be in line with the US. So that's why the changes came into place. And also a lot of the regulations were really old and outdated. So this gave them a chance to update everything. So the scope of the Safe Food for Canadian Regulations is export, imports, and interprovincial trades. Those are the three main things that it addresses, and food for human consumption. The Safe Food for Canadian Regulations also focuses on food fraud, intentional adulteration, tampering, and food terrorism. As we know, this is something that seems to be more common nowadays than it was in the past, and it wasn't addressed in the other regulations. And then of course, it was to even the playing field. So we know that there were registered commodities versus non-registered commodities. And those non-registered commodities could export their products and they didn't have to have food safety programs or inspections and things like that. But now it doesn't matter if you do any of the following, the exporting, the importing, or interprovincial trade, you have to follow the Safe Food for Canadian Regulations and make sure you are meeting all of those requirements. So what they did was they basically consolidated a bunch of acts together and regulations. So in the past, you would have the Meat Inspection Act, the Meat Inspection Regulation, Fish Inspection Regulations, and then the Canada Agricultural Products Act had 11 acts and regulations, which were like maple and dairy, processed fruit and vegetables, shelled eggs, and then there was the consumer packaging and labeling regs as well. So now all of these fall under the Safe Food for Canadian Regulations. Keep in mind that you also must follow the Food and Drug Act and regulations. So the purpose of this guide that the Quality and Food Safety team recently developed and has uploaded to their website, basically it's a tool to help you meet the Safe Food for Canadian requirements. And it also assists you with interpretation. We know that when we go to the CFIA website, it's not always that easy to navigate or to understand. So this guide was put in place to help you folks interpret what the requirements are and how to meet those. So what requirements are being met and what improvements are required. So you're now able to take this guide, look at what you're currently doing, and determine whether you're already meeting the requirements or you need to add a little bit more or make improvements to your program. And it lists the current regulations to date. So how do you use this guide? The way the guide is laid out is it's laid out to match the Safe Food for Canadian regulations. So if you click on the Safe Food for Canadian Regulations, the PDF that's available on the CFIA website, you will see that this guide is laid out exactly like that. So each section has its own title. As we went through the table of contents, when we get to the preventive controls, you will see that that's Division 4. So maintenance and operation of the establishment. And then it talks about each of those subdivisions. So subdivision A is going to be the responsibility of the operator. And subdivision B is sanitation, pest control, and non-food agents. So exactly the way it's laid out on the Safe Food for Canadian regulations guide, you will see that that is how this guide is laid out. So it talks about the requirements. So that's the first thing. What are the specific regulations that you must meet? Then there's a rationale under that. And the rationale is the reasoning. why these requirements must be met. And then we give an interpretation. So how can you meet these requirements? There's also a little checklist that's included in the guide. And this checklist is meant to be used as a tool and a guide to ensure you are meeting those requirements. And then we have the appendix, and it's a guidance and resources to frequently asked questions that a lot of clients come to us asking. And then there are those downloadable forms that I already talked about. So these are editable forms, documents that can be used as is or as a guide. So just keep in mind that you have to tailor them to your specific operation. So determining the requirements. We also added a simplified timeline for the fresh fruit and vegetables. Now, CFIA also offers this timeline when you go to their website, but we've simplified this a little bit for you folks so that it's easier to understand. Now, it's your responsibility to review this timeline and ensure that you are meeting the requirements. The easiest way to do this is to ask yourself, what do I produce? What do I do to that product? And where is it sold? So keep in mind that the scope of the Safe Food for Canadian regulations is the exporting and the importing and interprovincial trade. And of course, it's product for human consumption. And then you're going to ask yourself, do I meet exemptions? Because if you do, then you don't have to maybe have a license or a preventive control plan. It just all depends on the activity that you're doing at your operation. So ask yourself what you're producing. What are you doing to that product? Are you just harvesting that product and growing the product, or are you doing other things to that product, doing culls and cutting and chopping and packaging and labeling? So what are your roles and responsibilities? You folks have to ensure that you're meeting the regulatory requirements. So you're following the fresh fruit and vegetable section of the Safe Food for Canadian regulations. And that the food you are preparing, whether that's going to be domestic or for import or export, is going to be safe each and every time you produce that food or you handle that food. You also have to ensure that the food complies with compositional and grade requirements. So this is that market fairness, and is something that CFIA is taken into consideration. Before, things would fall under the consumer packaging and labeling, but now that consumer packaging and labeling has been incorporated in the Safe Food for Canadians. Are you labeling the food and advertising the food correctly and in a way that is not false or misleading to the end consumer or customer? So one of the first things when you look at that timeline is going to be a license. So you have to decide whether or not you need a license. And again, this depends on the activity that's happening at your operation or at your farm. So a license is a permit that authorizes specific activities conducted at your farm. You do not need a license if you are growing and harvesting fresh fruit and vegetables for interprovincial trade. You also do not need a license if your only activity is interprovincially trading fruits or vegetables. However, you will require a license if you do any of the following. So you process fruits, fresh fruits and vegetables for export or interprovincial trade, meaning coring, chopping, dicing, waxing, treating. These are some examples. If you package and label those fresh fruit and vegetables in the field for export, you will also require a license. Package and label fresh fruit and vegetables in the field for interprovincial trade, where those fresh fruit and vegetables will not be subsequently processed by a license holder in another province. If you package and label fresh fruit and vegetables in a facility for export or interprovincial trade, you will require a license. So just a quick little glossary so that everybody's clear. Intra-provincial means selling within your home province. So if it's Nova Scotia, you're only selling within Nova Scotia. Interprovincial means selling across provincial borders, but within Canada. And then export is selling outside of Canada. And importing is when you're bringing in any ingredients or components from other countries. So why we need a preventive control plan? We need these to control hazards and mitigate risks. So when identifying hazards, you have the hazard identification, analysis, and then you have to come up with control measures. So the Safe Food for Canadian regulations tells us that we have to identify hazards in the food that can cause a risk of injury to human health. Once we've identified these, we have to identify and analyze the hazards associated with that particular food product. And then we have to determine control measures that are effective to prevent, eliminate, or reduce the hazards to an acceptable level. So the definition of a hazard is that it's any microbiological, chemical, or physical property that may cause an unacceptable consumer health risk. So here you'll see that we have three main types of hazards. We have biological, chemical, physical. Under chemical, there are also two other categories, and those are allergens and radiological. So when you are selling your product to the US, they may require you to identify the radiological hazards. And if that's the case, you have to ensure that your preventive control plan is addressing and identifying those. So what are some examples of biological hazards? Well, there are many different examples. There are types as well. So you have bacteria, yeast and mold, viruses, and parasites. So bacteria are the smallest and they're seen only under microscope. Now there's such thing as good bacteria and bad bacteria. The bad bacteria are the ones that we're concerned about. So those are the pathogenic bacteria. And some examples of those are Salmonella, E. coli, Listeria, Clostridium perfringens. Yeast and molds, there are also good yeast and molds out there. We couldn't have bread or beer without having good yeast, right? However, it is those bad ones that we are concerned about when it comes to food safety. And then the viruses. So some examples of viruses, hepatitis, the norovirus, and then there are parasites. So Trichinella, Giardia, Cryptosporidium. These are just some examples of biological hazards. Chemical hazards. These can be divided into a couple different sections. So naturally occurring, those are the mycotoxins, alpha toxins, petulin, and then there are added chemicals as well. So those added chemicals that we're talking about, those are pesticides that you may be adding, or herbicides, or any food additives. Keep in mind that under the chemical hazards, there are also two other things to consider, and those are your allergens and also the radiological hazards as well, as we talked about on the previous slide. So mycotoxins, alpha toxins, these could be moldy peanuts. There are also toxins associated with mushrooms, fomatoxin, which is in moldy wheat or corn, and then petulin is in moldy apples. So what are some physical hazards? Some physical hazards are glass, wood, plastic, metal, stones. The glass can come from cars driving by your fields and throwing bottles, and then you have glass in your fields. It can come from the pallets that you're using to put your product on, so splinters or nails. We know about the needles being put into potatoes in the past. So these are some examples of physical hazards. So basically a physical hazard is an extraneous matter or foreign object which is not normally found in your food, and these can cause injury or trauma. So here at Perennia, we refer to food safety systems as a house. And we're going to talk about preventive controls for the next little bit. But with your house, you always start with a good foundation. And the foundation is management commitment. We then move up to the rooms of your house. So the walls, the rooms and the walls of a food safety house is preventive controls, also known as prerequisite programs. These preventive controls and prerequisite programs control the environment in which your product is being processed. And then you have the steps to HACCP and the HACCP plan. So HACCP is steps and principles, and that's the roof. So just like a house, you cannot have a roof without having walls and rooms. You cannot create your preventive control plan, HACCP plan, without having your walls and your rooms and your preventive controls or prerequisite programs in place first. So your preventive controls controls the environment in which you're processing your product in the process. And then the HACCP plan, your preventive control plan, focuses on the product and process itself. So what is the definition of a preventive control? In the past, CFIA said that a preventive control plan was basically written programs that include policies, procedures, and records for controlling hazards. Now the definition of a preventive control is a combination of measures to achieve compliance with regulatory requirements that form a system focused on prevention to control risks to food. So these preventive controls control everything from the start, so the harvesting, straight through to all the processing steps, and looks at your production environment, the sanitation, equipment, maintenance, and hygiene, right through until you ship that product out or you distribute that product. Also, your preventive controls. So these are the preventive controls as far as safe food for Canadians go. So you have hygiene, competency, conditions respecting the establishment, conveyances and equipment, unloading, loading and storing, sanitation, pest control, and non-food agents, and then investigation, notification, complaints, and recalls. So your preventive controls cover 90 to 95% of the hazards in your facility or at your operation. And then when those do not cover it, you have critical control points that you would put in place. But 90 to 95% of the hazards at your facility or your operation is controlled by preventive controls. So the preventive controls with Safe Food for Canadians. This is part 4, division 4. So subdivision A is responsibility of the operator. So remember a few slides ago, I talked about the food safety system being the same as building a house. Well, the responsibility of the operator, that's that management commitment. Unless they are responsible for ensuring that we have all of these things in place and that we are identifying the hazards and controlling those, we cannot go any further. So we have to ensure that we are looking at all of the possible hazards and that we've come up with how we're going to mitigate risk and how we're going to control those hazards. Subdivision B is your sanitation, pest control, and non-food agents preventive controls. I just want you folks to be very clear that in the past, it was called prerequisite programs. The prerequisite programs are the same thing as preventive controls. But when CFIA comes in and they do your inspections, they are going to refer to them now as preventive controls, not prerequisite programs. Subdivision C is conveyances and equipment. Subdivision D is conditions respecting the establishment. Subdivision E is unloading, loading, and storing. Subdivision F is competency. So in the past, we had personnel and hygiene and training. And it was one thing to do training with your staff members, but you have to ensure that the training that you are doing with staff is effective. And how you check that effectiveness could be by interviewing those staff members. It could be by observing those. So you're checking the competency. It's one thing to train staff, but you have to ensure that they've understood what you've trained them on and what their roles and responsibilities are and what is expected of them. It's one thing to do, send your staff to a training and they get a certificate and it's like, okay, well, look, we have this certificate. So obviously the staff member is trained and understands that, but do they really understand? Were they paying attention in that training session? Were they playing with their phone? So checking their competency is really, really important. Subdivision G is hygiene. And then Division 5 of the Safe Food for Canadian regulations is investigation, notification, complaints, and recalls. Division 6 is your preventive control plan, so that HACCP plan. And then other sections of concern for you folks, Part 3 of the Safe Food for Canadian regulations goes over the license. Part 5 is traceability. Some of you may only be required to have a traceability program in place. And if that's the case, then your concern is going to be Part 5. Part 6 is commodity specific requirements. So in the past, we had your certain commodity regulations in acts, like the meat and the fish and the shelled eggs and dairy and fruit, processed fruit and vegetable. However, now it's all under Safe Food for Canadians, but Part 6 is where you look to find the commodity specific requirements. Part 10 is packaging. Part 11 is labeling. And Part 12 is grades and grade names. So remember before 10, 11, and 12 would have fell under consumer packaging and labeling, but now that is consolidated in the Safe Food for Canadian regulations. Now, I'm not sure if many of you have seen this nice little tool, but you can find this on the CFIA website. So basically, this is like a gap assessment. It's a little template that CFIA has and they offer, and you folks can go on and download it. You will also be receiving this at the end of the presentation, as well as those links. So basically, on the left-hand side, you will see that they give the Safe Food for Canadian regulations section. So section 49 would have been the responsibility of the operator. Section 50 is sanitation. 51 is animal and pest control. 52, non-food agents. And 53 is the conveyances and equipment. And this template goes on and on. So then it tells you what the requirement is. So for example, sanitation, it says the establishment and any conveyances or equipment used in it are clean and in a sanitary condition. Cleaning and sanitizing activities do not contaminate food. So now you look at this and you say, okay, well, does my program that I have in place already adequately address this requirement? Do I have a sanitation program in place? Do I have a list of chemicals? Do I have a master list? Do I have sanitation standard operating procedures in place? And if you do, you just check yes, and you put your justification in there. If you realize that you are not adequately addressing, you can check no and then list what you may need to improve on or what you may need to add to your food safety and quality management system that's already in place. So how do you develop and implement food safety and quality management systems? It's a 3-step rule. So first of all, you have to say what you do what you say, and prove it. So when it comes to say what you do, this refers to writing down everything that you do in your facility. So your policies and your procedures and your standard, your sanitation standard operating procedures and your SOPs. And then you do what you say. You also take those written documents to the floor or to the field or wherever it may be, and ensure that what is written down, what you say you're doing, is what you are actually doing. And then of course, it's one thing to say what we do and do what we say, but then we also have to prove it. And how do we prove it? We prove it by record keeping. So having those completed records on file and readily available for when third-party auditors come in or our CFIA inspectors. So we make those readily available. We show it to our inspectors or our auditors, and that's how we prove that we are doing what we say we are doing. Then of course, there are different documents. So types of documents: policies, procedures, work instructions, and records. So examples of policies, those can be your company policies. So the statement of commitment. What is your commitment to food safety? These are usually posted for everybody to see, so everybody knows what is expected of them. And then we have procedures. So your standard operating procedures. This is the who, what, and when. Also, as part of your standard operating procedures is a work instruction is going to be embedded within that as well. That is how you're going to do it. So your standard operating procedures talks about who's going to do that, what is the frequency, what they're doing and how they're doing it, because they may need to be using a calibrated thermometer or a calibrated device. So you have to be very clear on how to do it. And then there can be just plain work instructions, which is not detailed. It's just how you're going to do something. And then of course, there are those records. That's the due diligence. That's the proof. You complete those records and you're able to provide those when they are requested. So for example, you have a sanitation standard operating procedure, and then you have to fill out a sanitation record to say that you've done a daily clean or a monthly clean or what have you. Those records are going to show who did the cleaning, if it was acceptable. Your pre-op and your post-op may also be incorporated on that. And then if there were any issues or non-conformances or comments that the verifier has to add to those. So where do you start when it comes to developing and implementing these preventive control plans? First of all, we say develop templates for procedures. If you develop a template, it's going to be consistent throughout your entire program. So these templates are used for your work instructions or your sanitation standard operating procedures, or your regular standard operating procedures, and then records. Any existing documents that you have in place, use those. Don't come up with new documentation or new records or new standard operating procedures if you can simply add something to an existing document. Your staff members are already comfortable and familiar with what you have in place right now. So it's easiest just to add something to those existing docs if possible. You can start with any section in your food safety program. So you may want to start with the easiest. Some folks like to start with the hygiene policy. And if that's the case, feel free to do so. Others like to start with the most difficult because they feel like if they can accomplish and go through the most difficult section of their food safety program, that they can basically do anything when it comes to the quality and food safety management program. So it's totally up to you folks, as long as in the end, you meet all the requirements. So keep in mind, you have to write down everything that is currently being done and how it is being done. So like I mentioned, if you have to use a calibrated device, that information is included in your procedure. And then of course, does it cover the food safety program requirements? So depending on if you have, let's say, Canada GAP in place or SQF, whatever programs you may have in place at your facility, is it meeting those standards and the regulatory requirements? So your third-party audits and your regulatory audits, which is the Safe Food for Canadian requirements, regulations.
So Shelley, I'm going to add in here too, for those that don't know, if they have Canada GAP certification or they're following the Canada GAP program, that program is 99.5% compliant to the Safe Food for Canadian regs. So if you're using those documents, if you're getting audited to those documents or certified, you're covered under that. So a lot of these things are going to sound familiar, but this will reinforce why that program is important. Electronic documents are 100% fine. Use what you have, use what works. As long as you can show it to an inspector when they show up, it's fine. The one part that's missing with the Canada GAP is the grading and labeling and the weighing part. And a number of people are covering that under an SOP and any records they might use to check to make sure they're following that part of the Safe Food for Canadians requirements. So, you know, if you're following that, you're good and covered.
Great, thank you, Elaine. And then of course, as you're going through it, if you realize that you're not meeting, let's say Canada GAP or the Safe Food for Canadian regulation requirements, then of course you're gonna have to revise or add or do improvements to your program. So create a record to capture the information that's required. We always say, you know, it's important to be detailed, but not too detailed. We've seen 32-page SOPs and we've seen 2-page SOPs. Those 2-page SOPs can be as good or better than a 32-page SOP. So again, keep in mind that you want to address the requirements and meet the standards, but you don't want to put too much information in there. And I'll give you an example what I mean by that. One of the companies that we work with, they had a metal detection SOP. So of course they're going to identify the test ones that they are calibrating their metal detector with. So that's going to be ferrous, non-ferrous, and stainless steel types of metals. They're also going to identify the sensitivity of those. So let's say it was 1.5 millimeters, 2 and 2.5. But then the company went as far as describing the color of those test wands. Now, that's not always the best thing to do, because if they had to go back to the company and purchase a new test wand and it wasn't in the color that was described in their SOP, now they are not meeting what their SOP states. So putting a color in is not necessary. That's extra detail that could end up getting you in trouble and is not required. So keep in mind that you have to meet the standards or the regulatory requirements, but don't put in too much detail that's going to tie your wrists together. So key tips to keep in mind: keep your programs, your policies, your procedures, keep them simple. Use bullet points whenever you can, or flow diagrams. If you can use pictorials, that's great as well. And keep in mind, right at a grade 3 to 5 level, keep things very simple, easy to read, easy to follow. Your staff members are more likely to read and follow something that is very simple and to the point, as opposed to that 32-page SOP that is very, very detailed. And then of course, start by documenting what you're already doing. So anything that you already are doing at your facility, things that you already have in place, start by documenting that information. And we've already mentioned about using anything that you already have, existing documents, procedures, memos. Like Elaine said, if you're using electronic, that's fine as well. But don't be adding new procedures if you can simply add something to an existing procedure or document or record. Because again, your staff members are already familiar and comfortable with what you have in place. So just improve upon what you do have if you're not already meeting the standard or the regulatory requirements. Include pictures for those who may not understand or is not able to, follow the written language that you have. And you have to also keep in mind that if you have staff that speak different languages, they have to be trained in the language that they understand. So that's why sometimes using pictures is a nice idea for staff members that don't understand English or that it's not their first language. So this is an example of a standard operating procedure template. You do not have to use this example or follow this template. This is just an example. However, there are certain things that you should include on a standard operating procedure, like your company name or logo, the title of the document or SOP or whatever it may be, an issue date and a supersede date. These are important because you know that you're using the most up-to-date document. If you don't have an issue date or a revision date or supersedes, how do you know that you're using that most up-to-date document? And then an approval. So who approved this? Now, version number, that's not something that you have to include. That's a BRC requirement. So if you don't want to put a version number on, you do not have to do that. So there are some things that you want to consider adding to your standard operating procedure and should be part of it. The purpose. So what is to be accomplished here? The responsibility. Who is responsible and who is going to be that trained alternate if the person responsible is on vacation or is sick or is out of the, is not at the farm or at your operation on that specific day. So for example, if Amy's responsible for sanitizing and doing sanitation and Amy's on vacation, sanitation does not stop because Amy is on vacation. Sanitation must go on. It's an important preventive control. So who is that designated staff or that trained alternate when Amy's not around? And then of course, the frequency. How often is it to be done? Is it to be done daily? Is it to be done hourly, monthly? You have to determine how frequently it's going to be done. And then the procedure, what is to be done? But not only what is to be done, but how is it to be done? So again, if you require a calibrated device, all of that information has to be part of your procedure. Corrective actions. So these are the actions to be taken if out of specification and is usually predetermined. Verification. Who is responsible for the double check? How is it to be done? Now keep in mind, the verifier should not be the same person as the monitor. So the monitor is that doer. It's the person doing the activity, and the verifier is the person double checking to ensure that the doer is doing the job correctly and monitoring what they're doing, what they're supposed to do. So there are some farms and clients that we work with, mom and dad pop shops, that's, you know, two people. And if that's the case, you may have to be the verifier and the monitor, but you don't want to have the verifier be the same person as the monitor if you can help it. So again, it just depends on your operation, your farm. And then those records. So the records are the proof, right? We are saying what we're doing. So that's this SOP. We write down everything we say we're going to do, and then we have to do it. And then the records, that's how we prove that we are doing what we say we're going to do. So the first preventive control we're going to talk about, which is subdivision A, is the responsibility of the operator. So what do we mean when we say the responsibility of the operator? Basically, you folks are responsible to ensure that you comply with the Canadian Food Inspection Agency's Safe Food for Canadian regulation requirement. So this is section 49 of the Safe Food for Canadian requirements. You have to ensure that food safety is fully embedded in every level of the business. So basically that you're meeting all the requirements, you have the necessary financial resources, the proper people put in the positions, that they know their roles and responsibilities, that those folks are properly trained for those positions, and that you're giving them adequate time to do their job. So what do we mean by all of this? The financial resources can be that your operation may require a new roof. Well, management's going to be providing you with that financial resource to put the new roof on, or you may need a new piece of equipment, or let's say the ice machine that you have in your operation is in poor condition and you need a new one. That you have enough people to do the roles at your facility. You have enough people on the field, harvesting the product, packing the product, labeling the product, people responsible for these quality and food safety systems, that they're properly trained, people responsible for doing any preventive maintenance or maintenance at your operation or on the farm is trained. Sanitation folks are properly trained. Staff members, when it comes to the office and investigation and recall, that all your recall team members are properly trained. And then of course, giving staff members the time to perform their duties. An example of this is sanitation. You don't want to be rushing folks on cleaning. Cleaning tasks are very, very important. It's a preventive control. If your equipment is not clean in the beginning, you're going to be adding potential physical hazards or biological hazards to the product when you bring it into the facility to do chopping or dicing or packaging or what have you. So you don't want to be skimping out on any of these tasks, whether it's sanitation or maintenance or what have you. So the next preventive control we're going to talk about is sanitation. So what makes a good sanitation program? Things you need to consider and be mindful of when developing and implementing a sanitation program is procedures. So what is required? How is it going to be done? Who's going to do that? Who's going to be that trained designated alternate when the main person is not available? What is the schedule for doing the sanitation? Some sanitation tasks are daily. Some sanitation tasks may be done during production. Others may be monthly or annual, depending on what it is. What chemicals are you going to be using as part of your sanitation program? Are those chemicals approved? Do you have a master list and all of the proper personal protective equipment in place if required for using those chemicals? Is sanitation staff members trained on the concentrations to be used or how the chemicals are going to be used or the cleaning methods? And then of course, how are you checking the effectiveness of your sanitation program? Are you simply doing a visual inspection, whether that may be a pre-op or a post-op? Are you doing ATP swabs? What are you folks doing to check the effectiveness? So sanitation focuses on keeping your facility and your equipment clean. It also focuses on keeping the premises clean as well. If the facility or your operation or your premises is in clean, pristine condition, then you're less likely to attract pests, rodents, whatever it may be, to your facility. And then of course, if your facility is super clean inside, if a pest gets inside, they're not going to stick around because there's no source of food for them and they're going to move on to the next place. So sanitation program, these are also things you should keep in mind and consider when developing those sanitation programs. The training, are staff trained on the chemicals? What about WHMIS training? Where are your chemicals stored? Are they labeled correctly? What about the SDS and the MSDS sheets? Do staff members know where to go to find that binder or those papers if there's a spill or if they splash chemicals in their eyes? Do you need to have disassembly diagrams? So if there's a piece of equipment that you have at your operation that's a little bit complicated, it may be a good idea to have these diagrams or pictorials. Are you giving them clear instructions? Are they detailed enough to know what being asked of them. Prioritize your activities. So your food contact surfaces are of priority. Those are most important. Do you have a master sanitation schedule? So remember, I had mentioned some things you clean daily, some things maybe monthly or quarterly or even annual. It just all depends on what you're doing at your facility or at your farm. Pre-op inspections and records, are they readily available? Is somebody doing those pre-ops or post-ops? Are all the chemicals that you're using for your cleaning and sanitizing approved for use at a food establishment? Is the person verifying the sanitation program trained and know what is expected of them? And then, of course, if there's any issues with the sanitation program, are you recording those corrective actions and documenting the corrections? So when it comes to checking the effectiveness of a sanitation program, these are just some examples that we see clients use. They may do a visual inspection. So those are your pre-ops and your post-ops. Some may swab or do plating, and then others may use ATP swabs as well. And of course, when you're checking the effectiveness, if there are any issues, you have to document your corrective actions. I'll give you an example of corrections versus corrective actions. Let's say Elaine is the person responsible for cleaning the stainless steel table where I'm going to be chopping my lettuce every day. Elaine has missed the top left-hand corner. I go in, I do the verification, the top left-hand corner is dirty on Monday. I go in and I check it on Tuesday, it's clean. Wednesday, it's clean. Thursday, it's clean. On that Monday, I made a correction, and I've noted that the top left-hand corner was dirty. So I simply re-cleaned it and I sanitized it. Now, if I notice that Elaine, the same person, left that left-hand corner dirty Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, I'm going to have to do a corrective action because obviously Elaine's missing something, or maybe she doesn't have the proper tools to do her job, or maybe she's just not understanding something. So that's an example of a correction versus a corrective action. The next preventive control is pest control. So just like your sanitation program, you have to consider all of these things. You need procedures, schedules, chemicals, mapping, and then checking the effectiveness or trending of the pest control. Now, you may choose to have pest control, a third-party company come in and take care of pest control for you, or many of you may be doing your own pest control, and that's okay as well, as long as you are ensuring that you are meeting all the requirements. So whether you're doing in-house pest control or you've hired out that you've contracted out that service, you need to have written procedures. So who is the person responsible for the pest control? How often are they going to be checking on the pest control? How are they doing it? Who's going to verify that? Now, keep in mind, if you have contracted out your pest control, it is still your responsibility to ensure that that company is doing what is expected of them. I'll give you an example of something that happened with one of our clients. So they contracted out pest control to a third-party company, and they had a couple different buildings at their facility. And they knew that, let's say pest control, the exterior baited device 5 was at least a minute from device number 6 because of the location of the buildings. When the team lead, so the food safety team lead, was looking at the service reports, she noticed, because a lot of these companies will now use a bar scanning system where they just have a little scanner and they scan the barcodes. She noticed that it was scanned within seconds. And she thought, that's funny. And then she started to look at the other ones, and all the other devices were scanned within seconds as well. So what happened here was, one of these contracted providers was, he came to the facility, he signed in the facility, he went back out to his vehicle, He had a piece of paper with all of the barcodes stuck to the piece of paper. While he was sitting in his truck having a cigarette and reading the paper, he was randomly scanning the codes on the paper in front of him and not actually checking the devices at the facility. So it is your responsibility to ensure that they are doing their job, even though you've hired them to do so. And they're not cheap. So make sure they are providing you with the service that you expect of them. Any chemicals that they are using or that you are using have to be recorded, how much you're using, what you're using, and then the SDS, MSDSs for those chemicals being used have to be kept on site as well, or included in your pest control binder. There should also be a map of your devices. So your exterior devices, which will be your baited stations, your interior devices, and then any fly lights that you may have. If you are administering bait, you folks have to be certified to do so. If you're using a preloaded bait station from, say, a Home Hardware, then you do not require the training. But if you are purchasing bait and opening up exterior bait stations and applying those, then you have to be trained and certified. And then, of course, checking the effectiveness of whether or not your pest control program is actually working. So what are some common pests? Mice, rats, minks, groundhogs, flies, moths, wasps, ants, spiders. Birds could be domestic animals, dogs and cats. Keep in mind that even service animals, if you are doing, let's say you're bringing product into your facility to cut, chop, dice, label, package, you are not allowed to have any service animals or domestic animals in your facility. And then of course, there's the wildlife in fields, and they can be hard to contain. So what are the main goals of pest control? There are two main goals. First of all, we want to prevent these pests from getting into our pack house or our storages. And of course, we already talked about sanitation, right? So if we keep our pack house and our storage areas in pristine, clean condition, this is going to eliminate them coming in. It's not going to attract them to our pack house or our storage areas. And then of course, if they do get in and it's in such clean condition, they're not going to hang around because there's not a source of food for them or harborage areas for them to hang out and make nests and have babies or what have you. Eliminate any harborage spots, old pallets that may be laying around or up close to your facilities, any tall grass. So tall grass should be maintained, or roosting areas, take care of those. These may be for birds or holes in your facility where animals can get in and hide and live, make nesting, have babies, be comfortable, get out of the weather. So be mindful of those when you're doing your inspections, whether they're interior or exterior. On the exterior, any garbage bins you have should be covered over and removed regularly. And then of course, keeping the doors to your pack house and your storage areas closed, tightly sealed. Any screens you have to fence or exhaust or anything like that should be properly screened. Windows in your pack house or your storage areas should also be properly screened. And then the second goal is to prevent conditions that will allow them to live in the facility. And how do we do that? Is we have a good sanitation program in place. And then when it comes to the exterior, we're eliminating any possible harborage spots for them. So discouraging them from entering fields, this is not an easy task for sure. So this is an example of rodent traps. These are baited pest devices, exterior devices that we see contracted companies use. We also see little pipes that can be in the shape of a T that folks that do their own in-house pest control may use. So basically it's an upside down T, and they will hang bait from the top of the upside down T. The little rodent or what have you will run in, nibble at it, and then continue through. These devices aren't meant to contain the pests. It's meant for them to come in, nibble on the bait, and go back to their nesting spot and eventually die off. This is an example of interior rodent traps. So snap traps are not ideal and they cannot be baited. And of course, what do we usually bait snap traps with? Peanut butter or cheese, right? And what's peanut butter and cheese? Those contain allergens. So snap traps are not ideal, and you should have these tin cats, is what we usually refer to these as, the ones on the right-hand side. So these are tin cats. They can be plastic or they can be made of this material. And on the bottom, there's usually a sticky pad and adhesive. Now these traps, once the rodent enters, they cannot get back out. So basically they stick to the sticky pad and then they eventually die, and you have to get rid of the rodent. When getting rid of them, ensure that you are cleaning and doing a proper sanitation, and you are not disposing of them in your pack house or your storage area. Fly lights. So the zappers on the left, these are something that should not be in your facility. When an insect comes and gets zapped, they can actually spread 2 meters in each direction. So the light on the right is the device that you should have at your facility. Basically, it has bulbs that attract the insects to the light, and then in behind is a sticky pad where the insects will basically stick and be contained. Also, when you are inspecting these fly lights, it's important to ensure that the sticky traps are in good condition and they're not too full. Change them out when you see that they are becoming heavily soiled by insects, because of course they will not work, or they will be less effective if you're not changing them out. So elements of a good pest control program, just like your sanitation and the other programs we talked about, who's responsible? So we're not going to put the name of the person because people come and go, but we're going to use the title of that person. So who is the person responsible for taking care of pest control? Is it a HACCP coordinator? Is it a food safety team leader? Is it a PCP manager? And then of course, numbering the stations. So with each of your devices, whether they are exterior baited stations or interior stations or fly lights, each of these devices should be labeled, and then the location where they are located should be labeled as well. So the wall above them. That way, let's say it's wintertime and you're plowing or whatever it may be, and a device goes missing, you will know that, oh, there used to be a device here. We have to replace that device. List of chemicals. So any chemicals that you're using for controlling insects, pesticides, what have you, the concentration needs to be listed, how much is being administered, and which device did you administer or add that chemical to. And then the map. So it's one thing to have a map, but ensuring that your map is up to date. Let's say you've had a corrective action, you've had some issues with rodents, so now you've added more tin cats, so interior stations or exterior. That should be reflected on your map, and you ensure that the map is up to date. And then any records are on file. So when your inspectors come in, they can see these records. Your records will also help you determine whether or not you're having trends. So let's say June and July, you're seeing that there's more presence of rodents, and then later on in the fall, you're not seeing them or what have you. This helps you trend or maybe find problem areas. And then of course, if you are having any issues, you have to do corrective actions. Now, if you're using an outside contracted company and they send you a recommendation, which would be written on your service report, or they would discuss this with you as well. So let's say they've identified a hole in your pack house. You have to actually do what they're recommending. So if they say there's a hole in the foundation, this may allow for the entry of rodents, you have to do up a corrective action and correct that issue. So if you are hiring and you've contracted out pest control, some of the things you have to keep in mind and ensure is being done. Make sure the contractor is not leaving any chemicals on site and that no pesticides are being used inside the pack house or the storage areas. And then of course that they are recording how much pesticide they've used, where they've used it. And then your binders that they provide, going through and ensuring that the license are up to date, that they have their certifications included as well. If a new technician is sent out, he needs or she needs to provide you with their certification as well. Is their insurance up to date? Or is the MSDS and SDS up to date? The MAP, is that up to date? So all of these things should be up to date when going through your pest control binder. And again, you are paying these guys and it's good money. So ensure that they're giving you the best service that they can be giving you. But it is your responsibility to be verifying their work and ensuring that they're doing what is expected of them. And then I already mentioned, do the corrective action that they recommend. So if they recommend that you screen an external vent or what have you, that you're actually doing those corrective actions, but you're recording them as well. So now the next preventive control that we're going to talk about is non-food agents. So what are non-food agents? These refer to your cleaning chemicals, sanitizers, your maintenance, lubricants, hydraulic oils, whatever it may be, your food grade greases, and any agricultural chemicals that you're using. Now, I just want to bring something up because a lot of folks don't realize, but some maintenance lubricants can be soy-based. And what is soy? Soy is an allergen. So I do recommend when you go back to your pack house or your storage area that you take a peek at any maintenance lubricants you may be using, your food grade, and just ensure that those things aren't part of it. So it's not a soy-based lubricant, as you may be introducing a hazard that you didn't even realize you were introducing. Receiving controls. So when you're receiving any of these, whether it's chemicals or agricultural chemicals or maintenance, oils, paints, what have you, that you're receiving them not at the same time that you're bringing in any of your crops or your harvest or what have you. And then of course, when you receive it, that you are taking it to storage in a timely manner. So it's going to the dry storage facility, or it's being put in the chemical cabinet or closet or whatever you may store your chemicals in, that your food grade lubricants are labeled and kept separate from your non-food grade maintenance chemicals. And of course, are they approved for use in the food establishment? So do you have that documentation? Do you have proof that these chemicals are approved for use in a food establishment? And then the standards for storages, storing your chemicals separate from where your food is being stored and separate from your maintenance chemicals, and proper labeling. So let's say you are dispensing cleaning chemicals in a spray bottle. That spray bottle needs to be properly labeled so that your staff members know what is in that bottle and how to use it. The next preventive control we're going to discuss is conveyances and equipment. So under this preventive control, equipment design and installation is really important. So we want to prevent contamination. And how do we do that? Well, we look at our equipment. Is the equipment designed and installed to allow easy access for the cleaning and maintenance? Let's say you're using a vac pack. Most vac packs need to have an oil change. So where is that vac pack located? Where is it situated? Can the cleaners get around that? Can the maintenance staff get to where they need to do that oil change? Can they change the seals out easily? Your ice machine, if the ice machine needs to be cleaned or maintained, can staff members easily access and get around that piece of equipment? Are the equipment designed and have smooth, cleanable surfaces? So basically, if you're doing any welding, is the welding smooth? So not bubble gum type welds that can harbor bacteria. Are there missing links when it comes to conveyors or graters? Are there cracks in your equipment or in your conveyors? Are they installed for proper drainage? So far too often we'll go into a facility or an operation and we'll see that a piece of equipment requires drainage, but it's not piped to the drain. So it's just readily flowing on the floor and there's pooling water because of it. So if you're using a piece of equipment that requires water that's going to drain out of it, it has to be properly plumbed over or piped to the drain. When you are bringing in equipment, some things to think about is, where did you get that piece of equipment from? Did you buy it brand new? If you bought it brand new, did you get it locally? Did you purchase it from another country where perhaps maybe you can only source replacement parts from that country? Does that mean you're going to have downtime or that you have to bring in a service technician from another area? Are you going to be able to source replacement parts locally? And then did that piece of equipment come with corporate documentation, so an operating manual or a service manual? And if it did not, where can you go to find it? So the internet can be a great place to find manuals, whether it be service manuals or operating manuals, that you can go and type in the model and serial number and then use those if your piece of equipment that you've just purchased does not have that documentation with it. So why do we do preventative maintenance? So preventative maintenance is different than reactive. Reactive is when there's a breakdown, then we deal with it. We want to do preventative maintenance so that we are reducing downtime and preventing problems before they occur. So some examples of preventive maintenance: changing the oil in that vac pack machine that you have, or greasing bearings on pieces of equipment that you may have. Those are some examples of preventive maintenance. So basically those things don't fail and then have downtime, and then we're doing the reactive maintenance later on. So if you're not doing preventive maintenance, it can lead to food safety issues. So how do you proceed when it comes to developing a preventive maintenance program? First of all, you're going to inventory all the equipment in each of your buildings. So whether it's a pack house or the storage area or what have you, and you're going to start with the critical equipment. So the ones that are in food contact with the product. And then you have to come up with a frequency. So how often do you have to do preventative maintenance on this piece of equipment? And a piece of equipment may require different maintenance tasks and activities and different frequencies. So let's say you have a bearing and you have to change oil and you have to change seals. Well, you may be greasing your bearings daily. You may be changing your oil annually, and you may be changing seals quarterly. And if that's the case, all of this information has to be written down for that particular piece of equipment that you have at your facility. And then who's going to be responsible for doing the maintenance, the preventative maintenance? And how are you going to document it and record it? Not many people have electronic or software for maintenance. Most people do it by hand. So basically use an Excel spreadsheet or they have maintenance, preventive maintenance records that they use. Some will even use their Outlook calendar, as long as you are doing the task on the frequency that you're supposed to do it and that there's a sign off. And then of course, after maintenance is done, taking care of that piece of equipment, somebody's inspecting the area to ensure that the tools have been picked up and removed and that that piece of equipment is clean before you put product back on top or back on it or in it or whatever it may be. So calibration is also part of the conveyances and equipment section. And what is calibration? So the definition of calibration is measuring the accuracy of a device to a known standard and then making an adjustment if necessary. So let's say, for example, you have a scale. You have certified test weights that you put on your scale and you check to ensure if it's 1 kg that your scale's reading 1 kg. If it's not, you may have to make an adjustment if you are able to do so. We cannot calibrate scales that are used for trade. Only service technicians that are certified are able to calibrate a scale. What you can do is a scale accuracy check. So, some other examples of devices that require calibrations: thermometers, chemical applicators, spreaders. If you have any dosing equipment for cleaning, sanitizing, any lab equipment you may have, pasteurizers, pressure gauges, these are examples of other devices that would require calibration. So just like your preventive maintenance program, you would do the same with a calibration program. So when developing these programs, you identify the critical measuring devices first, and then what are the procedures? Who's going to be responsible for that calibration program or calibrating that device? How often do you have to calibrate that device? Also, who's going to verify? What are the records that you're going to use? Do you have records solely for, let's say, thermometer calibrations versus if you did have a metal detector calibration? So it just all depends on the activities that you folks are doing at your pack house or your storage or at your farm. And then you have to consider any food safety risks when it comes to your calibration. So critical measuring devices are those whose function is to prevent the biological, chemical, or physical hazards. So conditions respecting the establishment. This is the next preventive control. So some of the things that fall under conditions respecting the establishment: the exterior and the interior building construction and maintenance of it. So what's the floors, walls, ceilings, windows, and doors like at your facility? Are they in good shape? Are they in good repair? Do they require maintenance? Are your windows screened? Are your doors sealed properly? Materials that you're using for doing renos or constructions or maintenance, are they approved for use in a food establishment? Do all of these prevent the entry of insects, rodents, or other vermin? So those doors we talked about, are they properly sealed so that they are not allowing entry of rodents, insects, or what have you? Are they designed in a sanitary manner? So basically, are they smooth and cleanable? What is the size of the layout in the facility? This is something else to consider. Does your pack house allow for the room required to do all the activities that you need to do? Do you have to control movement within and into your facility? And separation of incompatible activities. So let's say you have waste set aside or culls or what have you. Is there any way that those bins may contaminate the product that you're working with that's going to be of use for human consumption? Other things to think about: Controlling food that may be returned. So some of you may accept return product or non-compliant product. Where are you storing those products? Is it segregated and is it labeled? And are you inspecting that in a timely manner if it's a perishable product so that you can put it back in stock or get it out or dispose of it or whatever, what have you may need to do with that product that's been returned or non-compliant. The lighting also falls under conditions respecting the establishment, and we'll talk about lighting in a little bit. Ventilation is something else that you have to consider. And then of course, are the ventilation, is that screened? Conditions of heating, cooling, or humidity. So if you have humidity controlled rooms, are they at that humidity they're supposed to be at? If you have refrigeration, is the refrigeration at the temperature it's supposed to be at? And then your employee facilities. So employee facilities, we're talking about washrooms, change rooms, lunch rooms, hand washing stations. Do you have proper hand washing stations? And then sanitizing installations if required. Sanitizing installations could be hand sanitizing, it could be foot dips. Waste and inedible management also falls under conditions respecting the establishment. And your water, gas, ice, and steam are other things that fall under conditions respecting the establishment. So building location. Some things to consider is, are there any sources of contamination? So do neighboring properties, is there a potential for contamination? Is the area where your farm is located subject to floods or prone to infestation of pests because it's heavily surrounded by trees and areas like that? Areas where waste cannot be effectively removed. So where are you located? Does the waste management companies come to you on a weekly basis? Are you located somewhere where they can readily access and get to your waste to remove it? Now, if you have neighbors and it is a source of contamination, there's only a few things you can do. Basically keeping your location as clean as possible, making sure it's in a sanitary manner, that nothing around has harborage areas for pests and rodents and what have you. And then of course you can talk to your neighbors or perhaps contact the municipality to ask them to ask folks to clean up, or maybe you might want to put a fence around your farm or your location. It just all depends on what's going on around you. So building exterior, things we have to think about when it comes to the exterior and the surrounding perimeter is the design, construction, and maintenance. So is the exterior in good condition? Are the windows screened? Are they tight? Are they in good condition? The siding on our building, is that in good condition? The soffits, the doors, windows, air intakes, are they screened? What about our roofs? Are our roofs leaking? Are they in good condition? Are we inspecting our roofs every so often to make sure that nothing can come in through the facility and contaminate our product? And is it soundly constructed to prevent leaks and entry of pests? So when it comes to the interior, some things we want to think about: the floors, walls, and ceilings. So we already mentioned this. Are they smooth and are they cleanable? Are they constructed with approved material for use in a food establishment? Are the windows in our pack areas or our storage areas, are they screened? Are our doors close fitting? Our hand wash stations, are they conveniently located so that when staff members come into the facility, they are readily available and they're going to wash their hands as opposed to having to walk all the way across the room and then wash their hands? Is there an adequate number of hand wash stations? Are they hands-free? Now this depends on your standard. So if your standard states that you have to have a hands-free sink, then of course you have to follow the standard. And then sanitizer. So sanitizer in high risk areas. So your cut vegetables. Now, because of COVID, we know that all of the facilities, pack houses are going to have hand sanitizer right now because of COVID. So I'm sure that most of you will have sanitizer available for staff members at this time. Employee facilities, your washrooms, lunchrooms, and change rooms, are they kept in good, clean, sanitary manner? Is the garbage can in your lunchroom overflowing, or are you ensuring that you're keeping that dumped on a regular basis? Any food or sugar that may be lying around, is there potential for insects to come into your lunchroom? Is your change room kept in a clean, pristine manner? Is your interior and exterior protective equipment separated? So basically, let's say you wear an apron when chopping, cutting, labeling, packing your fruits and vegetables. Is that in close proximity with odor wear? So people's outside jackets or hats or what have you. Equipment cleaning and sanitizing facilities. So are they smooth and cleanable? Are they separate from processing? So what we mean here is you may have a separate area where you are taking pieces of your equipment or knives or bowls or what have you to clean, so that water's not splashing around and contaminating your product as you're processing. Do you have adequate water temperature and pressure for the activity that you're using? So certain chemicals may require your water temperature to be a certain temperature or pressure, or let's say your cleaning regime is to use low pressure or high pressure. Are you meeting those requirements? Is your cleaning equipment appropriately designed and maintained? So are your cleaning hoses in good condition? Do they have cracks in them? Are they filthy and need to be cleaned? If so, this is something that you should consider. So I'm going to talk about waste next, and then we're going to take a break. So I forgot to tell you folks at the beginning that at 10:30, we will take a 15-minute break just so you guys can stretch or use the washroom or what have you. So I'm just going to finish off the next slide, and then we are going to take a 15-minute break. So when it comes to waste disposal, we're not just talking about waste, but also cross connections of your sewage and effluent. So no piping over production areas, like no washrooms located over the production area, the packing area, that could potentially contaminate your production area. Are they trapped so that odors are prevented? And then the waste containers that you have in your facility. So let's say your solid waste containers, are they clearly identified whether you're using labels or color coding? Are your culls separate and labeled differently than your regular waste containers? Are they leak proof and covered? And then of course, are you cleaning them on a regular basis? Compost areas, so culls, are they separate from your other areas? If let's say you need to keep your culls at the facility because your contracted waste provider only comes weekly, where are you storing those? Is it going to create the chance of attracting pests into your facility based on where you're storing those culls? And waste areas and culls, are they ventilated or refrigerated if required? Okay, guys, we're going to take a 15-minute break. So I will see you all back here at 10:45. Okay, hopefully everyone had a chance to take a little break. Also, I just want to remind you guys that there are a little question and answer section. So if you have any questions at all as we're going through, Elaine is compiling and fielding those questions. So please feel free to type in any questions that you may have. She can answer them as we go. And then of course, at the end, we will have a Q&A session as well. So we're going to continue on talking about conditions respecting the establishment. And now we're going to talk about ventilation. So ventilation is important such that it must be adequate to prevent the accumulation of dust, steam, or any condensation. Also, if you're using compressed air, it has to be cleaned. And what I mean by compressed air is some, not so much in this commodity, but other companies, they may, let's say, put a puff of air into a bag so that it basically opens the bag before product falls into that. And if you are doing that, then of course that air must be filtered and cleaned, and you have to prove that. Positive air pressure in microbiologically sensitive areas. So basically that means that the air flows from the cleanest area of the facility to the dirtiest. So let's say it's not coming in, shipping and receiving and going into your processing room, it's going the other way. So this is important for sensitive areas. When it comes to light, there are three things that are really important, and that is your color, protection, and intensity. So does the color allow for the true lighting and color of the product that you're looking at? So when you're looking at your lettuce or whatever other fruits or vegetables you may be handling, are you seeing the true color of that product? Is your lighting protected? So do you have protective screens or shades on those? And then things to keep in mind, the lux readings. So what we mean by lux readings, those are the intensity of the lighting. And in storage areas, it's recommended to have a lux of 110. In processing areas, it's recommended to have a lux of 220. And then any QC inspection area, it's recommended to have a lux reading of 540.
If
So
just let me add in there, Shelley, if you guys
Sure.
are using the silicone light bulbs you can buy at Canadian Tire or Home Depot or whatever, after a while, if they've been in for quite some time, that silicone will start to sag off. You'll notice it. And if that's the case, you need to replace that bulb because the glass is starting to slip off the glass and your glass is no longer protected. And a number of those light bulbs, you might be able to use those too on if you're out in the field and grading or using a conveyor belt when you're harvesting. You have to make sure those lights are protected or shatterproofed as well because you don't want glass in your field.
Great. Thank you, Elaine. Water, ice, gas, and steam quality. So the water that you're using has to be potable and follow the recommended frequencies when testing the water. So this all depends on your standard or your water source. Usually it's recommended that if you're using well water, you test it quarterly, and if it's municipal, you test annually. Now, I will tell you with CFIA, you only have to test your water annually. So follow the sample collection procedures. What we mean by this is make sure you're not contaminating that container, that when you take the cover off of your collection container, that you are holding it and not setting it down, but not touching the inside of the cap so that you may contaminate the water that you are putting inside the container. Also, if the container has a substance in the bottom, do not dump that out. That is meant to be there. And only fill the water to the fill line, and be cautious of the flow of the water when taking a water sample. So you don't want it splashing, you want a nice slow flow, and you want to be running your water for quite some time, say 3 to 5 minutes before collecting that sample. And also always collect the cold water, never the hot water. So what is the standard? For total coliforms, it's none detected for 100 mils. And for the E. coli, it's also none detected. If you are not within the standard, you have to record the corrective actions for the unacceptable results. So what are you going to do now that your water source is contaminated? Are you going to stop using that and bring in water from an external source? You have to have all of this information recorded on the corrective action so that you're not using non-potable water.
Shelley, I'm going to add in there too, agricultural water has a different spec altogether, and that's available on the Health Canada website. And usually with anybody following the Canada GAP program, especially, you need to do that pre-season sample. That's before you start cleaning, start hand washing, everything. Right out of the gate, you have to do that water sample. And then you have to do one a few weeks or depending on your season. If it's only a 4-week season, you have to do it within 2 weeks of actually producing and harvesting, or give it a month or so, as long as you have those 2 tests before your auditor comes on site, and they have to be compliant tests as well.
Ice. Water used for ice making must also be potable, and your ice has to be tested at least once a year. Elaine, is there special testing parameters for the ice?
There is for Canada GAP. It's all in that water quality section in the Canada GAP manual.
So yeah, you folks need to know which standard you're following and then always meet that standard. So for Safe Food for Canadians, it says once a year. But if you are following other standards like Canada GAP, of course, you're going to be going above and beyond. So the ice making machine equipment that you're using needs to be cleaned and maintained. If not, this can be a source of a potential hazard that you may be introducing to your finished product. So if you have any bacteria in that ice making machine and all of a sudden you're adding that ice to your product, now you've just added that bacteria to your finished product. So this is why the equipment sanitation is so important, keeping this stuff maintained and in a clean and sanitary manner. If you're bringing ice in or outsourcing, again, the ice has to be coming from a potable source, and you may want to request certificates of analysis so that you have those on file to prove that the ice that you are bringing in and using is coming from a potable source and within spec. Your ice storage needs to be cleaned and maintained. So your ice making machine, where the ice is being stored, the scoop that you may be using to scoop the ice out and put it on your product, that scoop should be designated for the use of ice and kept in a clean manner as well. And then of course, just like the water, if there's any issues with your ice or it's of non-compliance, you have to have the corrective actions for those unacceptable results. So when it comes to water and ice and all of that, filters and backflow preventers. So if you're on municipal, you may have backflow preventers where annually a plumber's coming in and checking on that. If not, when we talk about backflow preventers, we're also talking about vacuum breakers. So these are what you would put on the end of your hoses. So let's say your hose is on the floor, which hoses should not be lying on the floor. But if it did end up lying on the floor, that if there was any pooling water, that water could not come back in and contaminate your hose. So you can purchase these vacuum breakers from your home hardware stores. And then water filters. So if you have filters on your water, let's say it's for sediments, that you're changing those filters when need be. Adequate volume. So do you have the correct pressure of water required and the temperature? So we mentioned earlier that some of your chemicals may require you to have a certain temperature of water. And then depending on how you're cleaning, if you're cleaning with a high pressure machine, does that allow for the correct pressure of the water coming out, or low pressure, or whatever you may be using? If you are storing water at your facility or using recycled water, is it covered and cleaned? Your boiler and water treatment, if you're treating that, are you treating it with the correct chemicals? And of course, is that equipment maintained? And then you don't want to have any cross connections or recirculated water contaminating your finished product. So other things to consider under conditions respecting the establishment are the following. And they're not labeled as such, but they're labeled as incompatible activities and things like that. So an allergen control program, you may not have allergens per se at your facility, but some of the things you want to think about is, can allergens be introduced into the process? For example, your employees, they take lunch, they eat egg sandwiches, peanut butter sandwiches, they may have a glass of milk or what have you. If they're not trained to properly wash their hands and ensure that they're not bringing those allergens into the packing area or what have you, now they may be handling your product and the allergen residues may now end up being part of the finished product. So that's something you want to consider as an allergen control program. You might not have allergens that you are using at the facility or part of your finished product, but your employees may actually be bringing them into the facility. If you are adding food additives and nutrients, you have to be following Health Canada guidelines. So certain additives, nutrients, and processing aids, some say that you use good manufacturing practices or good agricultural practices, and others will actually give you limits. And if they are limits, then of course you have to follow those limits and not exceed them. And then your foreign material control program. So this is like your lights, inspecting your lights. So like Elaine already mentioned, if you're using those silicone bulbs, is that silicone coming off, and can that bulb now be a potential foreign matter that may be introduced into your finished product? Knives that you're using, do they have chipped off blades? Are the blades cracked? Any foreign matter that may be coming in out of the fields, how are you addressing those? So now we're going to get into the next preventive control, which is unloading, loading, and storing. So under this section, we talk about the conveyances, so your trucks that you're using to ship your product out, or if you're receiving product, the tractors that you're using to bring the product in from the fields, or the trailers that you may be putting product in. Unloading and loading of that food, and then the storing of your food. So the conditions of the conveyances used to convey food. If you require your product to be shipped out in trailers that maintain a temperature, then you have to ensure that that trailer is capable of maintaining a temperature of, let's say, less than 4 degrees. And of course that you're putting it in a clean trailer bed. So let's say the truck's pulling up, it's getting ready to load on your product and ship it out to your customer. Is the back of that truck clean and in good condition? What about the tractor that's being used in the field? Is that in a good condition that's not going to become hazardous to your finished product? So leaking hydraulic fluid or excessive grease, things like that. And are these conveyances free of allergens or other incompatible items? So let's say you open the back of a truck that you're shipping your product out and you see that there's chemicals and they're going to be stored directly in proximity with your finished product. Is that a potential chemical hazard? Yeah, it could be. So these are things you want to inspect when shipping your product out or bringing it into your facility. Unloading and loading. You want to do this in a manner that prevents damage. So of course, not stacking heavy boxes on top of one another. Let's say the pallet can only contain 12 boxes of your product, that's the limit, and you do not put any more because you would damage your product. And also, when loading trucks, they have a load line at the top. It's important that you don't load your product any higher than that, let's say for refrigerated trucks, because you need that circulation for the air and the cooling to ensure your product is staying cool the entire time that it is being shipped on that truck. Storing food and non-food items. So we mentioned this a little bit earlier, that your chemicals are stored separately from your food products, that they're not in close proximity, and they're not going to be a potential risk of contamination. Everything should be stored off of the floor or the ground, at least on a pallet or a racking system or what have you. So other things to consider under loading, and storing, your food carriers. So we already talked about those, doing the inspections when the food carrier pulls up to your facility, or also your trailers, your bins that are being used to convey the product from the field to the pack house or storage house or what have you. Purchasing. If you are purchasing, let's say, packaging material, are you able to trace that packaging material? Is the packaging material that you're purchasing from an approved supplier? Is it the correct packaging to be used for your finished product? Your approved suppliers, so harvesters, are they on your approved list that you're bringing product in from? Let's say you purchase blueberries from a harvester, but you're doing the further processing of them or what have you. Labels, are you doing in-house labels, or are you having your labels printed by a contracted company? Are you receiving and shipping your product in a timely manner? And what we mean by this is, let's say your product requires refrigeration. Before that product is shipped out, are you letting it sit on a dock where it's not temperature controlled for an extended period of time that may be of risk to your product? Or are you keeping it in that cooler until that truck pulls up and then you're going to load the truck with it? So shipping and receiving in a timely manner. And then of course, storing your product in a timely manner is also important. So when you receive those non-food agents or your raw materials that you may be bringing in from another harvester because you may not harvest it yourself, are you putting those in the proper storage areas in a timely manner?
Shelley,
Yep.
can I add something in about seasonal storage? So
Sure.
A lot of these folks are probably doing some seasonal storage, not producing all year round or packing all year round. Be very, very conscious of where you put your equipment. A lot of people put their tractors inside for the winter in a pack house. Make sure if you do that, that your packaging is well clear of that area and that your equipment is all clean so pests aren't attracted to it. And the other thing to think about is your packaging when you take it out of storage, because some of these people are using trailers. Make sure that it's clean and that dry and there's no mold or pest intrusion when you take that packaging out. Really take a look at it, because I know some people are buying ahead this year because of the COVID. They're stashing some stuff so they're all ready to go next season in case there's supply issues. Just be really conscious of how you're storing that equipment and storing that packaging.
Thanks, Elaine. Returns and suspect product. So if you are handling return product, we mentioned this earlier as well, that it is identified and there's an area or it's separate so that you are not sending that product back out. So who's going to be the person responsible for inspecting that returned or suspect product? And then of course, if there is an issue, doing the investigation on why the product is moldy or whatever it may be, or there's an issue with it. And then there are 4 things that you may be doing with this. You may have to throw that product out. You may have to send that product for testing. You may be able to rework the product or restock the product. So it all depends on why the product was returned to you in the first place. If it was returned because they got the wrong size, then you're going to be able to restock that product. But if it was returned because it was suspect or requires more testing, you're going to have to put that product on hold and send that product out for micro testing. And then depending on how long it takes to come back, if it's perishable, you may have to throw it out anyways. And then you have to have the records and be able to trace the product if you're reworking it or bringing it back and putting it back in stock. So the next preventive control is personnel, hygiene, and competency. So under personnel, there are many different training programs and training that is in place. We have employee training programs. This can be anything from an orientation, so a new employee just starting. It can be training that you have to do because a non-compliance was identified by CFIA or by yourself during an internal audit that you're doing, or by your third-party auditor. So let's say you have Canada Gap in place. It's also your annual training, that refresher, or if you're seasonal, of course, training prior to starting up again. Also under this training would be your general food hygiene training. So that's your hand washing, what protective clothing you're expected to wear. If there's no jewelry, that you train staff that they are not to wear jewelry. What are they to do if they get an injury? What's the visitor policy? If a visitor's coming to your field or your pack house, are they expected to sign in on a visitor log? Also training staff to ask people that they're not familiar with, who are you? Who are you here to see? Why are you here? That's got to do with food defense as well. Then there's technical training. So for those people who are responsible for maintaining, reassessing, developing, and implementing your food safety quality management systems, there's special training for these folks, HACCP training, CCP training, maybe sending them for Canada Gap training or Safe Food for Canadian regulation training. There's also maintenance. Your maintenance staff may require training. If you're bringing a new piece of equipment in that nobody's familiar with, you're going to train staff members on that. Sanitation is also going to require training. They need to be trained on what is expected of them, how they're going to be cleaning, what type of cleaning method are they using? Are they using manual, so that elbow grease, scrubby pads, brushes? Are they using low pressure or high pressure? Are they using a foam? Are they mixing the chemicals in a mop, not a mop bucket, but a bucket of water and chemicals? Do they know the concentration they're supposed to be adding? So there's so many different training that will take place at your facility. And then of course, once you do the training with your staff members, there's checking that competency. So do they understand what they were trained? How do we check competency? Interviews, on-site observations, looking at records that they may be required to fill out, and then ensuring that the folks you have in the roles, are they qualified? Do they know what is expected of them? And does it make sense to have that staff member responsible for that particular activity? Maybe you thought that, let's say, Betty Jane was the most qualified to run the grading, but in reality, she's not. So you're going to assign her a different task. It just all depends, and you folks will know your employees the best, obviously, and where they are best suited. So under general hygiene and food handling, this is where we talk about hand washing. So washing your hands before starting work, after using the washroom, after they're smoking or vaping, or after they're eating, because of course, if they're eating and handling anything that may contain allergens, they may bring allergens into your facility. Illness and diseases. So basically what we mean here is training staff members so that they come to you and let you know if they have any communicable diseases that may be transmitted through food, or when they're sick, letting you know that. But then of course, it's your responsibility to monitor staff. So if you see that someone's going to the washroom more often than they usually do, is there something going on? Not everybody likes to miss out on work or miss out on a day's pay. So of course, as a supervisor or a manager, you have to ensure that you're monitoring your staff members. Do they know what protective clothing is required? So if your policy states that they're going to wear a hairnet, do they have hairnets? Are they readily available? Are they wearing them properly? Do they have gloves, disposable gloves, if you're asking that they wear disposable gloves? If there's no eating, drinking, or smoking, ensuring that that's not happening. Now, sometimes some operators will allow for a water cooler or water bottles. And if it's a water bottle, it's the type that you don't unscrew a lid. So basically it's all one part, it's a clear bottle, and it's labeled, and it's kept away from the processing area or your tables or handling of the product. Jewelry, what's your policy on jewelry? If there's a no jewelry policy, folks shouldn't be coming in wearing earrings or watches or what have you. Now, some standards will allow for a plain wedding band or allergy alert pendants. So if that's the case, just make sure you have it written like that in your policy. Injury, the number one thing is tending to the victim first. So if somebody cuts themselves, go and deal with the injury first, and then go and make sure you put everything on hold, you clean it, you dispose of that product that may have blood or what have you on it. But always tend to the victim first, and then get rid of your product after you ensure that the victim is okay. Clean clothing. What we mean by clean clothing is we don't mean coming to work in your Sunday best. That's not what we mean by this at all. What we mean here is that some of you may work with farms before you even come, so handling livestock. So we don't want you coming in with dung maybe on the bottom of your shoe and walking through the packing area or the storage areas. And then product handling. So how will you handle product that may be contaminated? Meaning if that product falls on the floor, what is your policy? Are folks allowed to pick it up and simply cut off a side of a head of lettuce because it's going to get chopped up anyways, or do they have to dispose of that product? So what is your policy on products that fall on the floor? What is your policy with products that say there's condensation above on the ceiling and it drips into your product? How are you going to handle that product? Are you disposing of that product? And does everybody on the floor know how to deal with that? The visitor policy. Where do visitors sign in? What is your visitor policy? Where can they find your visitor log? And do you have the hygiene policy close by so that when visitors do sign in, they know what is expected of them? So a visitor is not just anyone showing up, like say visiting your plant, but also your auditors, your inspectors, if you have consultants or those contracted pest control providers and technicians, these are all examples of visitors who should be following the hygiene and GMP policy and signing in when they come into your pack house or storage areas. So when do we wash our hands? We wash our hands before work, after using the washroom, after break or eating, after smoking or vaping, after coughing, sneezing, touching our food, or sorry, touching our face or touching our hair, or touching any dirty materials. So say we're in the pack house and we've touched a pallet on the floor, but we're gonna have to wash our hands before we go to handling the product. Now, there are different hand washing methods that you may have out on the field as well. You may have a little setup where you have a water container and you can wash your hands out there with some soap, or maybe you have wipes out on the field where you wipe your hands really well, dispose of those wipes into the garbage can, and then you sanitize your hands. Just keep in mind that if you are using wipes, you're not using like Lysol wipes, you're using the proper wipes for hand cleaning on the fields. Elaine, do you have anything you want to add to the hand washing when it comes to the fields and the pack house and things like that?
No, other than if you have hand washing in the porta potties out there for some standards, that it doesn't fly. So you have to have a separate hand washing station. And then don't get all excited to put in sanitizer everywhere, because everywhere you put sanitizer in Canada Gap, that classifies as a hand washing station. And that means you have to have the instructions and the wipes and the garbage can and all that stuff. So I know with COVID, everybody was stocking up on sanitizers. So just make sure that you have one designated hand washing station out in the field. It could be in a tote. It can be just away from the field is great. So.
Thank you. Employee illness and disease. Now, this is a little bit different since we're in a pandemic here. But in the past, if you have a runny nose or persistent cough, you were not permitted to handle food. Now, if you had a cold, you were allowed to handle food as long as you could walk away, blow your nose, wash your hands, and come back to the product. But now with the pandemic and COVID-19, we know that the symptoms of your everyday cold is basically a symptom of COVID-19. So anyone that has headaches, fevers, runny nose, persistent coughs, they shouldn't be at handling the product at all. And as mentioned, in the past, you folks may not have had sanitizer, but now because of COVID, sanitizer is going to be all throughout. It's going to be on the fields and in your pack house and your storage areas. So if staff members are sick, they need to report that illness to the supervisor or the manager, as contagious diseases can be spread and transmitted through food. So I already talked about this one. That was the on-the-job injury. So first aid, the employee is your number one concern. Then you're going to isolate product, discard it, and follow that by a complete sanitation. Also, I just want to mention open cuts, wounds, or infections, or any sores on your hands do have to be covered by a Band-Aid and then covered with gloves. So we mentioned this one as well. Sometimes I get a little ahead of myself. Any visitor that's coming to your facility, coming into the pack house, into the storage areas, have to sign in, no matter if they're inspectors, auditors, your pest control technicians, or consultants. So the next preventive control is investigation, notification, complaints, and recalls. So as of a couple weeks ago, there were 184 recall notifications in 2020. Some of these recalls for 2020, so Sunsprout alfalfa, that was recalled because of a biological hazard, salmonella, and it was classified as a class 1. Kim M. Co. produce brand yellow and red onions was also recalled due to salmonella, so another biological hazard, and rated a class 1. Fresh Express brand salads, these were recalled due to Cyclospora class 2. Golden mushrooms recalled because of Listeria monocytogenes, class 1, another biological hazard. Sobeys and Foodland brand Asian vegetable mix, recalled because of salmonella. This one was rated class 2. And then certain sweetened dried cranberries, these were recalled because of E. coli 0157H7, and it was classified as a class 1. So there are 3 classifications. Class 1 is the worst, and then class 2 and class 3. Class 1 and class 2, usually there is a notification. Sometimes you will also see notifications for class 3. Basically, if it's classified as class 1, it is the chances are highly that anyone who consumes this product will have an adverse health effect. With a class 2, the person consuming the product may have adverse health effects. And then class 3, it is not likely to be a health effect to the consumer. So this here is the email notification that you can sign up for, and you should be signed up for through the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. So you just go to cfia.ca and then click on About the CFIA, then go to the newsroom, and there's an email notification. You can sign up for all kinds of different things here. So you can stay on top of the latest food recalls. You can stay connected if there's any information on, like, for example, COVID. They put out COVID memos and things like that. You will also be able to sign up for those things. So there are lots of different triggers for recalls. Some of these are the following. So it can be because of an illness outbreak. So public health officials basically identify that there's some kind of a link between an illness and specific foods, and then they trace it back. It may be because, let's say, CFIA comes in and samples your product and sends it out, and the sample comes back non-compliant, so it's positive for E. coli or Salmonella or Listeria. Or maybe you're doing those tests and you get a non-compliant result. It may also be that CFIA comes in, and while they're doing an inspection, they find something that's in non-compliance. And if that's the case, that's also going to trigger a recall. You may have a recall based on a consumer complaint. So if there's a safety issue with your food product, this could trigger a recall. The company, you yourself, may initiate a recall based on any monitoring that you're doing, and you realize that, oh no, like, let's say, for example, you're doing the foreign material inspection, where you go around and you look up and you realize the light bulb's broken. Oh no, when did that light bulb break? Is there potential for glass to be in the finished product? You may be doing a recall now because you're unsure of whether or not there's glass in your product that was sent to the marketplace. It may be based on a recall in another country. So let's say you're importing fruits and vegetables and you're selling them, and that country had a recall. Now you may be also in recall mode. And then other triggers may be food tampering, or it's not meeting compliance. So what is a recall? A recall is basically removing your product from the marketplace. So you already shipped your product out, it's on the shelves, and now you need to get it back. So that's a recall. You're pulling the product back from the marketplace because it's not meeting legislation. So what's the Canadian Food Inspection's role when it comes to recalls? They are not there to do the recall for you. They are not there to help you with recalls. Their role is simply to gather information and to ensure that you are following your written recall program. So they may call you up and ask you questions. They may also call your customer and say, hey, did company ABC contact you and let you know that their mixed greens is going to be recalled? They may come in and collect food samples for testing. They are the folks who will inform the public with that email notification. So the food recalls, you go to the CFIA website, you will see that on the website, they've now issued a notification to the public. And with Health Canada's help, they come up with whether or not it is a class 1, class 2, or class 3 based on health risk. So Health Canada will go through the risk assessment of the recall, and then with CFIA, they will determine whether that's a class 1, class 2, or class 3. So basically, the CFIA's role is to monitor you folks and ensure you're following your written recall programs and to verify that what you're doing is effective. So that recall, you effectively recalled all that product back. And then they may do a follow-up with you. They may do the follow-up within a couple days, weeks. I've seen it go as long as a few months. So it all depends on the seriousness of the recall. What is important for you folks to know that if you realize you are in recall, before you contact CFIA, knowing all the information about your product. So basically, if you have a copy of the label, that is very helpful for CFIA and helpful for you as well. They're going to start asking you lots of questions. And some of these questions are going to be, is your product imported or is it domestic? What is the brand name of your product? Because perhaps you are co-packing for somebody else, or is it simply product from your own company? What is the common name of that product? Is it a cantaloupe? Is it cherries or dried cherries? What is the net content, the size or the weight? What is the package type? Are you packaging it in a pre-printed retail bag, or did it go out in a tray and a bunch of clamshells? How was that packaged and shipped out to your product? What are the specific codes, lot codes or date codes that's on the product? And what is the storage conditions of the product? So is this your fruits or vegetables, is that stored at ambient temperature, or is it, let's say, packaged mixed greens or vegetables for salad mix that needs to be refrigerated? And then how is the product going to be prepared? So these are questions that the CFIA will be asking of you when you contact them to let them know that you may be in a recall situation. So testing the recall plan. There are things that you need to know. Traceability is different than doing a mock recall or testing your recall plan. So traceability is simply one step back, one step forward. So can you trace back to where you purchased the raw material from, or your packaging or your labels or what have you? And then can you trace one step forward to the customer? And when we say one step forward, let's say you're supplying Sobeys. That's it, that you sent this amount of product to Sobeys, and that's as far as you go. When it comes to doing a mock recall and testing your recall plan, this is a lot more involved than doing simply a trace exercise. So your trace exercise is actually incorporated into a mock recall, or your trace exercise can be a thing on its own, which is just simply one step back, one step forward. Now with the mock recall, you're going to be looking at your entire recall plan. So who's my recall team? The contact information for my recall team, is that up to date? Is the contact names on the recall team, is that current? Do we have a new member that we've added but forgot to add to the recall team? So this is your chance to reassess and maintain that document. And then what about the recall coordinator for CFIA? Do you have their most current phone number and contact information and the correct person on file? Are you able to contact these folks when it's out of office hours? So let's say on the weekend or after hours. And are each member on the team, do they know their duties? Do they know the roles and responsibilities? And is it clearly explained to them, or is it trained? So the more you test your recall plan, the better it is for you folks if you are ever put in this situation, because you're going to be comfortable and confident with it. If you're not testing it frequently, then chances are it may be a bit overwhelming when it comes to the fact that you may be in an actual recall situation, because you're not doing that and you're not used to what steps you're going to take when that actual recall may come about. So the more you can practice this, the better it is for you folks. Usually you only have to test it annually, but again, know your standard and know your regulations. And if it requires you to be testing it more often, then you have to ensure you do so. And those recall team members, they also need an alternate designate. So if somebody's on vacation, who's going to fill in that role? Let's say we have the warehouse manager, the storage manager, who's where your product's being stored, is responsible for doing the inventory in your storage. Well, if that storage warehouse manager is on vacation, who's now going to check the physical inventory of the product that you have in storage? So again, you need to have an alternate for each of these roles.
I'm going to add something there, Shelley. For anybody who has a small farm or operation and basically there's only 2 people, you're probably on call all the time anyways, but don't think that your recall team just has to be limited to the 2 of you. If you have a trusted employee, that's a good option. Friends, family members, somebody who's really good speaking to the public, or you can even partner with another operation or farm and support each other through this. I've seen that work really, really well. So if you have a neighboring farm and you both need that traceability and that recall program in place, partner up with each other, because you know that's a valuable resource and support you can lean on in these situations.
So we've went over the Safe Food for Canadian Regulations overview. We talked about the purpose and how to use the guide in determining your requirements and the glossary. Now, we heavily focused on the preventive control requirements only because we have lots of questions that come in from clients based on that. And now we're going to get into the preventive control plan. So what is a preventive control plan and how do we develop it and implement it and maintain it? So your preventive control plan is similar to your HACCP plan, but it also incorporates like the market fairness, so the food fraud, and then if you were dealing with any livestock, all of that, the humane handling of the animals, that's a part of the preventive control. So basically you have a preventive control system or a quality and food safety system that would have preventive controls or prerequisite programs, and then your preventive control plan, which is equivalent to a HACCP plan, but has more added to it. So it's 3 steps. Basically, you have to develop your preventive control plan, and then you have to implement it, and then of course you maintain it. So these programs that you've developed, it shouldn't be put in a binder and placed on a shelf and collect dust. These are living, breathing documents. We know, for example, Safe Food for Canadian regulations changed, right? January 15, 2019, and we all had to start updating our programs. So again, standards change, updates come to Canada GAP and SQF and what have you. So you folks have to ensure that you are maintaining your program and you're reassessing and doing the internal auditing to ensure that it is now current and meets standards and regulatory requirements. So how do you develop a preventive control plan? The first step is you assemble the team. Step 2, ensure the establishment is operated and maintained as required. So remember, we talked about section 49, it's the responsibility of the operator. Well, the operator has to ensure that the establishment is maintained as required. Step 3, perform a hazard analysis and establish procedures. Preventive controls, remember, control 90 to 95% of your hazards at your facility. So when you're doing your hazard analysis, you're going to go through the motions and determine whether or not your preventive controls can fully control the hazard, or if you have to put critical control points in place. And then step 4, establish measures for consumer protection requirements. So remember I said that the preventive control plan is similar to a HACCP plan, but it also considers these other things. That's that consumer protection requirement that has to be added. And that's labeling, grading, packaging, the little portion that Elaine said is not covered by Canada GAP, but you can cover it off with an SOP or however you feel works well for your operation. And then step 5 is assembling all your documents. So the definition of a preventive control plan. It's a written plan that defines the procedures for maintaining control of any potentially hazardous food at the critical control points of food preparation or processing. So this includes food safety measures and consumer protection. So you're grading, labeling, and weighing. And if you were dealing with livestock, which you folks may be or may not be, of course, it would consider humane handling of the livestock as well. So this is an example of a product description, which we refer to as Form 1 at Perennia. You don't have to call it Form 1 as long as it addresses all the required information. So basically, what is your product and process type? And you may be able to combine this depending on the product. So for this example, it's ready to eat fresh cut vegetables. What is the product name? Shredded lettuce, shredded cabbage, shredded peeled carrots. Then you're going to identify the important product characteristics. So for this product, it's non-applicable, so we put NA here. Then you're going to identify any added ingredients. So if you were adding anything to this, you would add that here. Now keep in mind there's ingredients and there's input materials. So input materials may be that you're washing it with water, but that's not an ingredient, but it is an input that you have to consider, because that water, if it is not potable and it is not controlled, may introduce a hazard to your product. So we're going to identify that on the next page, which is the input and product ingredients. So then how is it to be used? Well, in this case, it's going to be eaten raw, so it's ready to eat. And then the packaging. So there are 3 types of packaging that you can have: primary packaging, secondary packaging, and tertiary packaging. Primary packaging refers to the food contact. So let's say it's plastic bags. In this case, they are going to package the product in a pre-printed plastic retail bag, or they may be putting it in single serving containers. The secondary packaging is going to be the label, the master carton, and the tape that they are taping the master carton up with. Now, if you're using staples to staple your master carton, that would be considered secondary packaging, and you want to identify this because staples could end up becoming a physical hazard. And then tertiary packaging would be your pallets and your shrink wrap. And the reason it's important to identify this, it depends on where you're sending your product. So for example, Costco requires you to send them only a certain pallet. And if you send them any other pallet, they're going to ship that product right back to you. Also, if you're sending your product to the US, they may require you to be using a heat treated pallet. And if that's the case, you need to ensure you're not sending it out on a regular softwood pallet. Also, just so you know, if you have a global food safety initiative program in place, so an SQF or a BRC, under the how is it to be used, you also have to identify for BRC the unintended use as well. And then who's going to be consuming your product. So if vulnerable populations may be consuming your product, those GFSI programs will expect you to include that on this form. So shelf life. What is the shelf life of your product? So for this example, we're saying 7 days as long as it's stored at less than 4 degrees. Where will it be sold? Retail, hotels, restaurants, institutions. It's going to be sold domestically, nationally, and internationally. So how do we label this? As per the Safe Food for Canadian regulations, but some examples of the requirements: the common name, the net quantity. If you're adding any ingredients, a list of ingredients would have to be on there. If you've added any ingredients that contain allergens, that information would have to be on there. The name and principal place of the business, date markings, so packaged on, storage instructions. So it's important for you folks to go to the labeling standards for fresh fruit and vegetables and ensure that you are meeting all requirements. And then also, if you're exporting it, the export country may have certain requirements that you have to meet as well. And then of course, the storage instructions. So for this product, we want to make sure it's kept refrigerated. And then number 9 is special distribution controls. So we're going to ask that the people shipping our product, transporting that product, is keeping the trucks at less than 4 degrees. So this is an example of Form 2. Again, you folks don't need to use these forms. These are just what we use. This is where we list the ingredients and the incoming and input materials. So we said that the raw materials was the shredded lettuce, the shredded cabbage, the shredded peeled carrots, and then we listed all those packaging materials again. Now here, we are going to list any inputs because it's not going to be an ingredient, but it may still contaminate your product if it's not controlled. So we're going to use municipal water. Maybe if it's well water, then you would put well water here. But for the purpose of this example, we're using municipal water to wash our fruits and vegetables. And then if you're adding anything to your product, let's say you're adding CO2 to the bags, that information has to be here too, and you have to ensure you're using a food grade gas. So then you come up with a process flow diagram. Now this process flow diagram was taken from the archived CFIA HACCP generic models. So it was ready to eat fresh cut vegetables. Now you may find generic HACCP process flows online, but it's your responsibility to ensure that what you are using it as a guide and a guide only. Far too often we'll see clients take a process flow from the internet and we get there and we say, oh, well, where's your metal detection? And they'll look at us and they'll say, we don't have a metal detector. Well, your process flow says you have a metal detector. So if you are using generic models, just make sure you tailor them to your specific process. So if you're receiving product and you're storing it, we do expect to see that. So for this one here, they've identified that they're receiving product, then they receive chemicals as well under number 1, and they store their chemicals separately from their fresh vegetables. So that's going to have hazards associated with it. And then your fresh vegetable storage is going to have different hazards associated with it. So you have to decipher between those different storages. So where you're storing your packaging material, where you're storing your raw material, so your fruits or your vegetables, and then your chemical storage. And then they say they do inspection, sorting, trimming, and then they do a wash. So you'll see here that to the right, it shows water, and the water's being introduced at step 6 at the first wash. So that's why it's important for you to include water as an input on or as part of your preventive control plan. So I'm not going to go through all of this process flow, but it's just basically to give you guys an idea that a process flow considers all inputs and all outputs. So something that is missing from here is the culls and the solid waste. So at the inspection, sorting, and trimming, most likely they're going to have culls at that section. Cutting, slicing, shredding, and grinding, there's probably going to be compost coming from there. And then down at the packaging and labeling, there's going to be some solid waste like the backing of the label, or maybe packaging fell on the floor. And if that's the case, that would go into waste. So you would identify your waste, your compost, your culls. And then when it comes, if you are doing metal detection, any rejects, what are you going to do with those? So you would want to show those outputs as well. So rejects are an output. Are they going to go back up into the metal detector? And if the metal detector now reads correctly, it's going to go back out through. Or if it's a reject and the metal detector detects metal again, it's going to go into the cull or the waste. So that information, it's important to include that. And then once you have all your process steps, you're going to identify what hazards are associated at each step. So a biological, chemical, or physical hazard. And then we use this and we go to our hazard analysis. And that's when we come up with, okay, if we have this potential biological hazard, how are we going to control it? Do we have a preventive control that will fully control it? Or is it partially controlled? Is it controlled not by the operator, but by the harvester? Or do we have to put a CCP in place? Yeah, I think that's all I wanted to address on that. So when you create and develop these process flows, you then have to take that process flow out to the floor and physically walk it. So that's basically you're verifying that the process flow you've written down actually matches the process that's happening out on the field or in the pack house or storage area or what have you. Form 4, so this is a plant schematic. On your plant schematic, again, remember we talked about if you have existing records or documents, use or add to those. So you'll see here that we've simply added the exterior baited stations to our plant schematic so that we don't have an extra plant schematic just addressing where the location for our bait stations and our interior tin cats are or fly lights. So you're going to show the plant schematic, all the rooms in your facility, how employees move through, where the packaging is received and how it moves through the facility, where you store it, where you actually package the product, where's the raw product coming in, any chemicals that you're receiving, where are you receiving them, how are they flowing through the plant or facility, where are you storing those chemicals, and waste flow. Where are you gathering your waste or your culls and where are they going? Are you storing them in a refrigerator? Are you storing them in a loading area? Are they going out the shipping area and being put in a compost bin outside your facility? And then also using this plant schematic, you would identify any cross-contamination points. So cross-contamination points are anywhere where lines may intersect. So let's say you're bringing the waste out through processing. Is there a chance for cross-contamination of your waste with your product? If there is, you would identify that as a cross-contamination point. Points where folks come in and they need to wash their hands. If they don't wash their hands upon entry, is that a potential cross-contamination point? So you would include that. It's also nice to include your hand wash sinks on this plant schematic as well. If you want to, you can include battery charging. If you have forklifts that are, require batteries or what have you, you can include that as well. So this plant schematic can be used for multiple things. And as with the process flow, you also, after you've created and developed your plant schematic, you take that into the pack house or the storage area or what have you, and you look at it and you say, okay, is what's written on here match what's actually happening out on the floor? If it doesn't, then of course you have to revise it. And if it meets it, great, you move on. So then the next step is doing a hazard analysis. So what does that mean? A hazard analysis is when you identify all potential hazards at all the stages. So that's the stage at the harvesting out in the field to the receiving of the product into your packaging house or into your storage area or receiving any imported products that you may be bringing in. So that process flow that you saw, all of those steps, you are going to do a hazard analysis of each and every one of those steps right until it goes out the door. And then, of course, including those cross-contamination points, which we already talked about on your process flow. So again, you guys don't have to use this form as long as you are addressing everything. So meaning that you've addressed incoming product, the cross-contamination points, and all your process flow. So all your processing steps. So you're going to identify at each of these which hazard is associated with these processing steps. Is there a potential biological, chemical, or physical hazard? And you're going to describe that. So let's say you have a potential pathogenic, it's Listeria, E. coli, Salmonella, and staph with employees not washing their hands and following hygiene. Then the next question is determine if fully controlled by your preventive controls or prerequisite program. So do we have a preventive control that talks about employee hygiene and training and things like that? We sure do. So with that being said, we would go down and we would say this is controlled by SOP, blah, 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 or preventive control, employee hygiene, and employee training. If we realize that, let's say, that specific step does not have a control that will fully control the hazard associated with it, then we may have to put a critical control point in place. So basically you walk through this and ask yourself the questions. So could a control measure be used by the establishment at any process step? If yes, you describe the control measure and you proceed to question 2. Question 2 is it likely that contamination with the identified hazard could occur in excess of the acceptable level or could increase to an unacceptable level? If yes, you identify that acceptable level and move on to 3. If you're identifying no, then you put the reasoning for that. So I'm not going to go through all of this because HACCP training is a thing of its own. And if you guys would like to do HACCP training, then you can always sign up for that as well. This is just a basic overview of preventive controls and the preventive control plan. But basically you go through all of these questions, and if at the end you answered and that it comes out to be a critical control point, then you list that critical control point. And then your critical control point is going to have critical limits associated with that. And your critical limits is what sets the acceptable versus unacceptable. So if it has to meet, let's say, a certain time, then if that time is not met, you may lose control and likely cause a health risk. So determine critical control points. At any step at which control can be applied to prevent, eliminate, or eliminate the occurrence or reduce it to an acceptable level, that was the definition of a critical control point with Codex. So basically, if you are to lose control, it is highly likely that a health risk will occur. So I mentioned this, critical limits is going to be a maximum or minimum value to which the biological, chemical, or physical parameter has to be controlled. So if you don't meet that minimum or that maximum, then you're going to have a potential health risk. So it's criteria that separates your acceptable from your unacceptable. This is an example of a critical control point form. So we refer to it as Form 10. Again, you guys, as long as you are meeting all the requirements and addressing this, it doesn't matter what template you use. You would put your process step on the left. What is the hazard, the CCP number? What's the hazard description? So is it a biological hazard? Is it a chemical hazard? Is it a physical hazard? And then what's the critical limit for that? So let's say, for example, it's metal. That's the hazard you're concerned about. So it's a physical hazard. Your critical limits here may be your calibration wands that you're putting through. So the 3 types of metal, ferrous, non-ferrous, and stainless steel. and the sensitivities may be 1.5 millimeters, 2.0 mils, and 2.5 millimeters. Then you're going to come up with monitoring procedures. And for your monitoring procedures, you're going to include the following. So who's going to monitor that critical limit? How often do they have to do that monitoring? And then what steps? How do they do it? Is there a calibrated device that they have to use? Are they using the test ones, because we're talking about that metal detection example? What's the important criteria? And what records do they need to fill out? So let's say they're doing metal detection, they fill out a metal detector. So let's go back to this form. The next column is deviation procedures. And again, this is a predetermined procedure of what would happen if it doesn't meet the critical limits. So let's say you run your product through the metal detector detects metal, the alarm goes off, the light flashes, and your belt stops. Okay, what do we do next? It may be simply that the person responsible for monitoring the critical limit sets that product aside and reruns the product through. If they rerun the product through and it goes through without any issues, then they're going to simply put the product on the pallet to ship it out. If they put the product through again and it dings off again, now they may be going and informing the food safety team leader, and that food safety team leader will come in and do an investigation where they start to separate the product and get it smaller and smaller until they are able to find the metal. So you have to do a thorough investigation when there is a deviation. And then verification procedures. So I'm just going to skip over here for a second. So verification procedures is very similar to the monitoring. You're going to write down who's responsible for verifying these CCPs, how often they have to do the verifying, how are they doing the verifying? So there's lots of different verifications. You may simply be doing an interview where you're asking the monitor, okay, so what are you monitoring? How often are you monitoring? What would happen if there was a non-compliance? What would you do? Or maybe you are going on site and watching the monitor do the monitoring activity. Or you might simply be doing a record review where, let's say, the person responsible for monitoring the metal detector, they submit a metal detection form at the end of the day, and you review it and ensure that it meets everything. So is their name on it? Is it filled out correctly? Was all the test wands identified when they put them through? Did the metal detector pick up those test wands? Did the metal detector pick up any metal in the product? Did product have to be put aside? So that's the things you're going to look at when it comes to record review. And then we'll just go back here for a second. And then the last thing is the records. So what records are associated with this critical control point? If it was metal detection, you may have a metal detection form listed. If there's calibration for the metal detector, you may have a calibration form as well. If there's critical, well, you're going to also list your corrective action report, just in case there was a corrective action. Then you're able to go back to the corrective action and look to see what was the correction, what did they do, how did they fix the problem, and how are they going to prevent this from happening in the future. So now we're going to talk about traceability requirements. So you have to effectively identify the product and then be able to retrieve a specific lot code. So remember, we talked about traceability is completely different than doing a mock recall. Traceability is simply looking at one step forward, one step back. So do I know where I purchased this raw material or this packaging or the labeling? And do I know where I shipped that product? So there are some exceptions, and you folks are responsible for going through and determining whether or not you meet the exceptions or you have to have these traceability programs in place. So one of the exceptions says fresh fruit or vegetable packaged in a wrapper or confining band less than 13 millimeters in width, or fresh fruit and vegetables packaged in a protective wrapper or a protective bag that is clear and transparent and on which no information is shown other than the price barcode, number code, environmental statement, or product treatment and symbol. So depending on if you meet these exceptions, you may not have to add all of this coding information. So for lot coding, these are some things you can do. Now, Safe Food for Canadian requirements refers to the code that can be used to identify the lot. So the lot that was either manufactured, prepared, produced, stored, grade, packaged, or labeled. And it can be numerical, it can be alphabetical, or it can be alphanumerical. And examples of that, maybe you're labeling it with a production date, a best before date, putting the establishment number on it, or your license number. So basically some way of identifying that this product was manufactured, prepared, harvested, what have you, at this particular place. So let's say company ABC. And then maintaining traceability. So make this work for you. This doesn't have to be anything formal. Just keep it simple. Whatever you're using now to track your sales, you can simply modify that or use it for traceability. So maybe you're just using harvest dates and you're putting them on invoices or logbooks. If that's what you're doing, as long as you can trace it, that is okay. Other options, the logbook might be something that you're just keeping a logbook and you're writing it in it. Maybe you're keeping electronic copies, so using an Excel or a spreadsheet. It simply may be on the invoice or the receipt that you're sending out. If you have a calendar and you're using the calendar method, you can do that as well. So this, you can be as creative as you want, as long as you are meeting the requirements and you're able to trace that somehow. Elaine, do you want to add anything to this section?
Yeah, I was just going to say in our guide on page 41 in the appendix is a really good infographic on what the actual labeling requirements are for consumer prepackaged product and bulk products. So please take a look at that. We're going to give you a link as well to the CPMA's and CFA's guidance document on traceability that really breaks things down into detail, which we don't have time to get into today on this webinar. So please look out for that link on that list we're going to send you as well. It's a great resource and really, really explains what needs to be done. That's all I had, Shelley.
Okay, thank you. Specific requirements. So this is something else that's important. Before, a lot of folks, they would just simply go to their acts or their regulations. But now, of course, it's all incorporated in the Safe Food for Canadian regulations. So basically, we understand that the CFIA website is not the easiest to navigate, and that's why you are going to receive a list of useful links. Basically, you can just click on it and we'll take you to all these places so that you're not having to go through the CFIA website and you're pulling your hair out trying to figure out where do I find this information. There are specific requirements, and this one here is for the fresh fruit and vegetable. So some of the things that they have on there is regulatory requirements for fresh fruit and vegetable. They also provide a video presentation for the fresh fruit and vegetable sector. There's Canadian grade information, grade names for imported product, grade standard requirements that must be met for imported from the US, units of measurement for the net quantity and declaration of certain foods, and then any of the specific export requirements as well. And then they also have maximum quantity limits for personal use exceptions. So it's up to you folks to know where to go to find this information. And like we said, we know that the website, the CFI website's not the easiest to navigate for everybody. So that's why we've come up with this guide and these resources for you folks to help you when developing and implementing preventive control plans. Again, if you have any questions, please add them to the Q&A section and we're going to address your questions here very shortly. So at the end of the guide, there is an appendix, and under the appendix, you will see how to draft an SOP policy or procedure, what to expect during your CFIA inspection, how to respond to a non-compliance, whether it's identified by an inspector or a third-party auditor. So let's say Canada GAP auditor. Labeling for traceability. So Elaine mentioned that there's a page there and it helps with traceability and it's laid out quite nicely. But then of course, after you've had some time to look at this guide, if you have any further questions, please feel free to reach out to either of us. It also has a little section on environmental swabbing plans because a lot of companies have questions with, well, how do I determine what I need to do? How do I write up this procedure? So that's there for you, as well as identifying cross-contamination points and addressing them on your plant schematic and your hazard analysis.
I'm going to add here too, Shelley, if people start filling out some paperwork or trying to write an SOP or even try to tackle that preventive control plan, if they want to know if they're on the right page, I know I certainly don't mind if they flip me an email or want me to take a quick look at something. I'd rather have you have the confidence to develop an appropriate plan for your operation or your farm. And there's, I mean, we only had a few hours here, and even then we couldn't get through everything we wanted to. So if you have questions with the guide or questions moving forward, don't be afraid to contact us. We don't mind taking a quick peek or answering your questions anytime.
Also, I'd like to add to that, if there's anything you would like to see us do webinars on, whether it's more involved on how to develop a preventive control plan or how to address traceability or what have you, please feel free to, submit those, and we will definitely consider doing webinars on those particular subjects. So if there's anything you guys would like to see, let us know. So we do have the Nova Scotia Agri-Food Accelerator Program. So there's funding available, and it's through the Nova Scotia Agricultural, it's available, to Nova Scotia agricultural businesses. Of course, you must meet certain criteria. And there's the Market Access Food Safety Accelerator programs. So there's 3 different sections here. It's Safe for Market program, the Product Safe program, and the food safety obstacles. So the Safe for Market program is the educational skills, fact sheets, email questions, in-person virtual training. This webinar, for example, falls under that. The video and the booklets, so that guide that we've developed for you folks. Under Product Safe program, if you need help with formulation or doing analysis of your product or risk assessments, any labeling, nutritional facts tables, there's funding available for that as well. And then food safety obstacles. So we can also do pre-assessments for you if you want to get into, let's say, Canada GAP, and you want a pre-audit done or a GAP done. That stuff can be covered, as well as also food safety program coaching. So the development and implementation of certain programs or standards. If you needed help with putting a PCP in place, this can also be covered under the food safety obstacles. So other resources, we have the Safe Food for Canadians Good Agricultural Practices. We also have e-learning available on our website. It's for food safety fundamentals, and there are 7 courses. They're about an hour to an hour and a half. Is it, Elaine?
Yeah, they're about, I'd say about 2 hours.
2 hours?
Yeah, you can do them about 2.5 hours. I mean, unless you're trying to do it when you're doing everything else, and then you can pick up and put them down anytime. And, you can start like do a half hour here, 15 minutes there, whatever works for you.
And if you do the e-learning, you will also get a certificate at the end of each of those courses. We also have a food safety resources that some of you may be familiar with and some of you may not be. But if you go to Perennia.ca And then across the top, you will find different tabs. Under the quality and food safety tab, you can scroll down and there's something called food safety resources. If you click on these food safety resources, you will see a bunch of different things available to you. So the Safe Food for Canadians Good Agricultural Practices Guide is available with those downloadable forms that complement this guide. You will also find resources, food safety during COVID-19. So under this section, there's general resources. So basically like the WHO, the Center for Disease, CFIA, you name it, plus webinars and fact sheets and recommended resources that pertains to COVID and the pandemic. You will also find the Safe Food for Canadians Good Agricultural Practice. Sorry, I already said that one. The Safe for Market booklet. So we have 2 booklets that's been published so far, the 2018-2019 edition and the 2019-2020 edition. Stay tuned as the 2020-2021 edition is coming out in 2021. There's also publications and fact sheets. So here you can find an array of fact sheets, anything from hand washing signs, employee training tips, preparing for an audit, and any of these new publications or fact sheets will be flagged with a little new symbol, so you know that these have just been recently uploaded to our website. Also, there's a recommended resource section where you can find acronym links, Safe Food for Canadians and the CFIA's most frequently used links, Canadian food labeling links, food defense and food fraud resources, links to importing and exporting, food safety standards, where you can go to find, let's say, hair nets and things like that, the Nova Scotia provincial information, and much, much more. So these resources were based on the most frequently asked questions of both the provincial food regulations and the Canadian Food Inspection Agency regulations. If you folks also want hard copies, please contact Clarissa McIsaac at cmcisaac@perennia.ca. So that's for the Safe for Market booklets. And then of course, this one's going to be coming out in hard copy soon as well. You can also find videos that are online. So basically we have a list of short instructional videos prepared to assist you when conducting particular activities or answer any questions you may have. And some examples of that is hand washing in the field versus hand washing in a processing facility. There's also how to enter and exit a food production area. There's how to do scale accuracy checks, how to use ATP swabs. So there's all kinds of different videos for you to view. And then there's also webinars. So under the webinar tab, you will find pre-recorded Perennia quality and food safety webinars that if you've missed it and you didn't happen to catch the original session, you can view the pre-recorded. So I just want to thank you all for joining us and attending this webinar on behalf of Elaine and myself.